would like to just start this session by thanking the Kogut Institute staff, Keith and Trouder, who made all this possible, and they really worked hard for us. So they deserve a lot of thanks. I hope they hear us somewhere. Yeah.
For the staff. And so I will introduce this session, and because of we're a little out of time and I have to get to the train station to get back to the city tonight, when I have to leave, I'll just hand the chair over to Adi, who will finish the job. Okay, so very quickly to introduce our two speakers, and they come really nicely after the last discussion because they also have to do with climate and Anthropocenes and this thematics. The speaker is Françoise Vergès, who is the chair of Global Souths at the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris, and her excellent book, Monsters and Revolutionaries, The Relationship Between the Colonizer and the Colonized, is one that, with which I am familiar. She's a political theorist. She was born in Paris, but she was raised at La Réunion and also in Algeria, so that she comes from the perspective of colonialism, post-colonialism from that side of Africa. And also, she has been working on a critique of the Anthropocene. Claire's word or concept is Uchronia, and François' word or concept is water. Now, I have to say that I forgot to announce what Adi said that I should announce, which is there will be another meeting of political concepts in New York City, March 15th and 16th, and it's at my own host place, the CUNY Graduate Center, where it will be an event of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, which will host tomorrow our next speaker. And so if you are going to be in New York, please see Françoise Vergès also there tomorrow night. No, not tomorrow night, Monday night. Yes. Monday night. Sorry. So I'm delighted that she will be a guest then, and we hope that we'll see all of you the 15th and 16th of March of next year.
I'm going to sit there, so I'm not turning my back. Well, thank you. Thank you to Lila, Adi, and Tim, but mostly thank you to those who have stayed, because it's like people are leaving. I don't want to take it personally, but I'm going to remain. If I see some people leaving, I will not take it personally. Okay, there will be no much Trump in my talk. It's not because I underestimate what's happening, and that the fact, the possibility of Trump doing a lot of damage. And there are moments in the morning when I read the newspaper, I feel like I'm suffocating, really. It's a physical thing. It's not just thinking about it. But as I say also, for me, there is a lot of nastiness around the world right now, and it's just Trump. I can think of Erdogan or Modi in India or Macron in France. So, and then also because I was suggesting, I would want to suggest to look at Trump from a different, from different point of view. For instance, to look at it from the history of defeat and, defeat of the left or defeat of the oppressed, and then how to rethink defeat. So, because the history of the oppressed is really a story of a lot of defeat, and how could we think about defeat differently? It's also, I'm thinking about it as a long road to freedom, this expression of African American or of Mandela. I mean, it's a long road. I mean, there is no moment. It's a long road, and the necessity, effectively, of revolutionary love. So there will. I don't think either it's so much a talk about the Anthropocene, but I don't know. Okay, why water? Well, a small biographical note. I grew up in a small island in the Indian Ocean, so water is absolutely present. You cannot. I mean, it's really as a historical and cultural site. And the Indian Ocean is also to give you another history than the Black Atlantic, the fact that African and Asian, traded for a century before the arrival of the European. It's not and you had the Arab navigator, Islam, so it's totally give you another cartography of the world. It's not so much a north-south thing. It's really a south-south place. So there was that. And there was also a sense for me of continuum between land, river, and the ocean, so not the kind of a cut, and of a connected and multi-layer world. And also the fact that when I grew up, that Indian Ocean was already the most militarized ocean in the world. One of the most important US military bases was being built in Diego Garcia, a base which, from now, planes are taking off to bomb Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. And it's a place also of rendition from which a lot of people were expelled without, wondering. So it's for me. Second, why water? Because there is a very interesting body of work on the access to water as a human right, on the racialized and gender politics of water, I want to focus here on the other body of water, on sea and ocean, which have been so central to the history of colonial conquest, of slavery, of capitalism and imperialism, instrumental to the constitution of European power, of international law, of global trade. And of sovereignty and colonial settlement and gender. And yet, water is largely absent in anti-colonial, post-colonial, or decolonial theory. They are mostly land-based. I'm talking about theory of emancipation. I'm not talking about literature, poetry, or music, where it's very present. And despite a growing body of rules and law that have historically drawn space of exception, and more recently offshore holding areas, shifting borders over water, despite the growing privatization of the seacoast, increasing militarization of the sea, decolonial theory remains land-based. Cargo imperialism, if we can call it like that, is neglected. As well as this idea of a continuum between land and water that exists in many, in fact, culture. Water is present also, was present in many slave rituals, it's still present among community of descendants of slaves and native coastal community across the globe. There are female and male deities that protect water. I mean, so all this, there is a vast library. But I will look mostly at water, how to bring the water again in anti-racist and anti-imperialist politics. So, water, drinking water and seawater have been both defined in international convention as the common heritage on humankind, which raises, of course, a series of questions. What is common to all, and what about the non-human species, and what is heritage, It is the same for those who wrote the law governing mobility over water, and those who, as Aimé Césaire wrote, were the vomit of the slave ship. Those who were transported as cargo, those who are today crossing seas and ocean and tracing new maritime route, new mode of sea traveling. It is the same also for community expelled to build resort, port, and marina. The oceanic mobility of the unfettered liberal subject masks the form of oceanic mobilities of what the feminist scholar Savanandi Pereira has called oceanic corpo-geography. Finally, there is a continuous presence of the term colonization and how its vocabulary reveals its importance still for capitalist and imperialist project. I mean, land project also, we can take of Israel, but over water. The term appears in texts about deep sea research today or about floating city. There is a lot of projects of floating city. There is a floating city project in New Caledonia and Tahiti, whose creator have declared, and I quote, "If we create jobs for local residents, government officials have indicated a willingness to allow us substantial political autonomy." So new kind. Or, there is also the Vergès project, which foresee mobile floating cities that will be used as a new resource for mining the relatively untapped resources of the ocean without disturbing its ecology. So this is, for me, what is interesting today. Alors, a little note about the story and representation about imperialist war and wars of national liberation in the second half of the 20th century. Contrary to World War II, which was heavily about the sea, sea battle, it's absolutely land-based. Where you look at the same in Algeria, Mozambique, Angola, Vietnam, it's land-based. And masking the role of the Navy to bring troops and weapons, or even also the maritime, the military base. I mean, the US, for instance, one of the most famous image where the sea appear is a famous helicopter being thrown over the ship when, the fall of Saigon. So water is coming back in representation today, in European representation, through the story of migrants rescued at sea, or from the image of their drowned body, the famous image of the 3-year-old Eldon Cordy. Yet it remains a space of stasis, of suspension. It's not a living space. So if there is a connection between Trump and water, it's more the example of unfettered capitalism and economy of destructive extraction, a symptom of the limitless desire to colonize every part of the planet. So my presentation after this little, wide water will be in 2 parts. First, I will look briefly at the role of water in imperialism and capitalism, at what global capital and imperialism are doing to water today. Then I will turn to the possibility of a black geography of water, drawing on the work of Sylvia Winter, Catherine McKittrick, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and feminists such as Savandrani Pereira. So first, very quickly, because it ends at 6:20, and I want you to go for a drink or water. So first, the White Sea, what I call the White Sea. The history of the sea is mostly a white history of ships traveling to unknown shore with adventurous captain and rebellious crews, of shipwreck and safe sailor, of trade captain, which are celebrated in the Maritime Museum of London, Paris, and even Macau. It's not just European Museum. And you even have a museum of shipwreck in Perth, Australia. So the shipwreck is part, effectively, of this heroic narrative of the liberal subject. And of course, more recently has been Titanic also as an important moment. And to the point, to the extent that Titanic has been shown to the refugee in the island of Nauru, the refugee in the island near Australia, and that was shown to them so to assuage their traumatism, so they could look at Titanic. So this history of the sea, as a white male history, is very important. And in the modern European narrative, the ocean is elementary distinct from land. Its historical figure, as I say, the seagoing individualist liberal subject, race as white and gender as male. Water has become an element in the spatial and legal demarcation of the nation and its limit. The birth of the nation authority to control its coastal waters has been traced back to the 16th century. In the 17th century, the father of the international law and doctrine on the freedom of the sea, Grotius, recognized the existence of the nation jurisdiction over the coastal waters that could be effectively controlled from the land. The extent to which a nation could control its coastal water was based on the reach of its cannon from the shore. Thus, the 3 nautical miles, because that was a limit of when you had the cannon shot. And in the US, in fact, the creation of a territorial sea and contiguous zone date back as early as the late 1700. That was quite early, that interest in the question of the sea. In the 18th century, as I say, there was a lot of literature of explorer, navigator, shipwreck, Robinson Crusoe adventure. But politically, controlling the sea became central to European power. And I recently, some years ago, I looked at the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which was the end of an important, of wars, religious war that had ravaged Europe. But it was also very important in terms of, what happened on the sea, because it gave to the English Navy the monopoly on slave trade with Spanish colonies, the Asiento, ensuring its domination on the Atlantic for centuries. So slave trade also, as we know, led to important progress in maritime industry and technology. Ships builders learned to construct ships that will carry greater human cargo at lower cost, and also progress in maritime insurance and banking. These improvements were very useful also after the abolition of slavery for the transportation of millions of Indian and Chinese, and in lesser number of African, to the colony. In fact, slave ships were configured to the transportation of Indian and Chinese. But also, it was important for the transportation of the 60 million Europeans who left Europe to go to the USA, Canada, Australia, South Africa, building what Bill Schwartz has called country of white men, on genocide, dispossession, and displacement. European 19th century narrative remained a narrative of domination over the sea. And the sea was effectively the site of unfettered freedom, where it was, of course, for others, the site of unfreedom. By 1930, the proprietary rights of the coastal state over the resource was well established, provided it did not interfere with the vessel right of innocent passage. It prevailed until the 20th century, but by mid-20th century, there was an impetus to extend national claim over offshore resources and challenge the 17 imperial doctrine. There was also Cold War, decolonization, and growing concern about long-distance fishing fleet, the threat to pollution and waste, and oil tankers. So a tangle of claim and competing demand for lucrative fish stock in coastal water, the growing tension between nation rights to this resource and those of fishermen, the prospect of a rich harvest of resources, increased presence of maritime power, and the pressure of long-distance navigation started to threaten the 17th century doctrine. And the first challenge to the imperial freedom of the sea was done by President Harry Truman in 1945. Responding in part to pressure for domestic oil interests, he extended unilaterally United States jurisdiction over all natural resources on the nation's continental shelf, which make even today still US the first maritime power. France is just after, but France is the second maritime power because of the overseas territory, not because of its coast along Europe. In the late 1960s, oil exploration was moving further and further from land, deeper and deeper into the bedrock of continental margins. From oil to tin, diamond to gravel, metal to fish, the resources of the sea were seen to be enormous. Then, in 1982 came the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, known as the Constitution for the Ocean. It was a comprehensive treaty regime to govern activities on, above, and below the world ocean, providing guidelines for how a nation will use the world seas and their natural resources. The United States was behind the wording of the convention. It occurred during a time of US hegemony over the world. But since it repeatedly refused to sign it, arguing that it imposed limits on its sovereignty. The fear is also that if the US were to join this convention, one of the Article 82, will require the US to transfer a significant portion of any royalty, that taken when they extract the resource, to transfer a significant portion of any such royalty to for redistribution to the developing world. And successive governments have refused to abide by this obligation. And also the convention claims the deep seabed resources of the ocean, the common heritage of humankind, and forbids mining unless permission is first received by the International Seabed Authority. And this has discouraged US companies from participating in this activity. The exclusive economic zone has been one of the most revolutionary features of the convention because it recognized the right of coastal states to jurisdiction over the resources of some 38 million square nautical miles of open space, of ocean place. And the major beneficiaries are the United States, France, New Zealand, Australia, and the Russian Federation of this. So that's my first remark. My second remark, quickly, is about the securitization of rescue that is also happening today. So if powerful states have been slowly transformed the imperialist 17 doctrine of the sea to protect their interest, a growing body of rule and regulation has also transformed the long-standing doctrine of the duty to render assistance to those in distress at sea, without regard to the nationality status or the circumstance in which they are found. Over the last decade, an increasing number of law, regulation, and practices on national, regional, and international level have effectively discouraged rescue at sea and encouraged seafarers to look away, leading to the incremental institutionalization of a norm of indifference to the life of those lost at sea. And we see that practically every day in the Mediterranean, but also in the Indian Ocean and also in the Pacific. These are less known situations. So the secularization of rescue has led to the weakening of the international rescue regime. Another point I want to make about this story, about the question of the White Sea, is the war doctrine. The doctrine of war upon sea has greatly evolved since World War II. Andrew Kepinovich, which is the CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, a Washington think tank with association with the Pentagon and his Office of Net Assessment, has written, I quote, that modern technology has shrunk the Pacific to the size of the Mediterranean. He suggests that national zone of exclusivity must expand even further into the ocean until they meet in the middle, creating a no man's land, or rather a no man's sea, where both sides venture only at grave peril. After a century in which freedom of maneuver was a norm in naval operation, much of the ocean, he said, will be carved into impassable killing fields. And my last remark on the question of the ocean is the question of scientific research and the alliance between scientific research and the military today on the ocean. Scientific research is expanded even to provide, and I quote, a recognized interdisciplinary forum to develop the awareness of the scientific and commercial opportunity for the exploration, evaluation, and exploitation of resources from the sea, commensurate with the proper requirement for the protection of the environment. Now, I mean, the protection of the environment is already this convention. So given all this, effectively, I've been wondering why there has been no interest in water in the sea. And so my second point is the black geography of water. And I want to introduce this part with the following excerpt of the poem Water, called Water, from the South African poetess Koleka Putuma. And I quote, "For you, the ocean is for surfboard, boats, and tan, and all the cool stuff you do under there in your bathing suit and goggles. But we have come to be baptized here. We have come to steer the other world here. We have come to cleanse ourselves here. We have come to connect our living to the dead here. Our respect for water is what you have termed fear. The audacity to tread and murder us over water, then mock us for being scared of it. The audacity to arrive by water and invade us." There will be a lot to say, of course, about that poem, and that excerpt. But let me just repeat that sentence: the audacity to tread and murder us over water. The audacity to arrive by water and invade us. To introduce the idea of the sea as a space of cheap nature and cheap labor, and also, so the Western, very quick, still, okay?
Yes, 5 minutes.
Okay. The Western conception of nature as cheap emerged in the 16th century with colonization and was contemporary to the notion of cheap labor, which are how I call slave trade, the cheap, endless, limitless resources of body to sell and traffic. At the heart of the strategy of conserving nature as cheap, sociologist Hassan Moore has written, it contributed to the construction, I quote, of nature as external to human activity, and thence nature to mobilize the work of uncommodified human and extra-human nature in service of advancing labor productivity. The genius of capitalism cheap nature strategy, say, was to represent time as linear, space as flat, and nature as external. So, and this idea of the cheap nature of a constant limitless, I connect it effectively with the notion of cheap labor, to look at water as a social site for creating not only white subjectivity, but also black subjectivity. And this is where I bring the theory of black geography as a method for rewriting the history of water from the vomit of slave ship, again, to use Césaire. Black geography, Catherine McCrittick has written, are what Frantz Fanon described as the history of historico-racial schema and the bodily racial schema. These two concepts advance how space, place, identification, and history collapse to inscribe the black body as racial other. McCrittick argued that the mutuality of identity, self, and place contribute to the understanding of what Sylvia Wynter has called being human as praxis. In Demonic Ground, McCrittick argued that the vessel of slave trade exposed a very meaningful struggle for freedom in place. The ship is the location of black subjectivity and human terror, black resistance, and black possession. So water is one of these sites, and a site of space-making practice among not only black, but also what we could say people of the sea. And so we can start from the importance of blackness to the geographical imagination, not only as a tool for understanding whiteness, non-being, and social physical death, but as a radical framework to envision liberation, social justice, and reconstruction. So very quickly, what is to be done? Okay, because this has been the question. I have a card at home which says, when injustice becomes law, disobedience becomes duty. So that connects also to what Anthony was talking about yesterday. And so a lot is already being done in terms of disobeying the rule and convention imposed by the imperial law of the sea. But nonetheless, I will propose that it's important to think the continuum between land and water, and what water is life, the land on us, I mean, what you were saying. To go also against the Hollywood imagination of water taking revenge over human, and I'm thinking of the film 2012 by Roland Emmerich, very bad movie, but whatever. Very quickly, there is a Maya prediction that, that there will be a huge tsunami which will go all over the globe. And so it's happened. But a small number of humans, led by some white men and some animal, some kind of Noah arks, are saved. They go to the Himalaya and they are saved. And they learn when they are finally on the ships that the only continent that has not been recovered by water is Africa. But the people living in Africa has been wiped out by the tsunami. So Africa is an empty continent to repopulate and recolonize. So a new beginning is possible. In a way, water has purified the world for a small number of humans who has been saved by technology. So water is a thread that can be beaten by technology. To which I want to oppose Aimé Césaire's word, and I quote again Aimé Césaire, those who did not invent gunpowder or the compass, those who never knew how to tame steam or electricity, those who have never explored neither the sea nor the sky, but those without whom the earth will not be the earth. In other words, refusing the vocabulary of life as war, of winner and lover, of water as a threat, reconfiguring what rescue means, and respect water, because as Koleka Putuma has written, it connects our living to the dead. Finally, about planting the seed for an alternative future. I want to offer, just to give a little understanding of the future from other people than the West. In Madagascar, the past is before you, because you know it. I mean, you know it has already happened, so you know what is the past. It's before you, and the future is behind you, right? And because you cannot know it, so you cannot see it arriving, And it can tap off your shoulder, but you are never sure that you will understand the future, which is tapping on your shoulder, right? So you can still, go on like that and not understanding that it's time to look at it. So perhaps we might learn to be attentive to what is already in the making as an alternative behind us, but that we don't see, but we can, of course, trust. So, and to be patient, as the Malagasy, suggests, not pessimist or discouraged, but patient and fighting without guarantee, as Churchill has invited us to do. Thank you.
maybe, Adi, it's good for you to start so it won't be interrupted, and then maybe I could ask a question, but I won't right away. Thank you so much. It was really beautiful, but I can't say that it wasn't depressing. So, yes, why don't you all go up there?
Françoise, I was really taken with this idea of, did you say the white ocean or just the White Sea? And I also would love to think about white water, which is often, cast as a symbol of danger and turbulence and so on. But just, the kinds of racialization that are embedded in the ocean. And I wondered whether your work at all engages with Linebaugh and Redeker's multi-headed hydra and the notion of the hierarchy.
Water, yes, Redeker work on the multi-headed hydra, yes. And there is a lot of book also now, on this, and I think they are very, very interesting. But I'm trying to look also, from other tradition of sailing and of other cartography of the sea and the relation between land and water that are different. So not just to question what the Western mythology, blah, 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 but really to understand, okay, how it works and how could it work then, how if we were thinking in this continuum, how this will work. And I have to say that I'm quite terrified by what's happening with the sea and the ocean in this term. I mean, the question of privatization of the sea. I mean, the fact that effectively they are extending. I mean, states are extending the space, and of course this affects first the fishing community, and we don't. I mean, and the coast is now for resort and for tourism. But so we don't see that borders are being drawn over in the middle of the ocean. Like we see it in the Mediterranean a little, but I'm not sure we see it. What we see is people drowning, and the narrative is about people trafficking, and it's bad, and we should rescue them. And it's not open sea, like effectively, what is the mobility over the sea? And the border, I mean, we talk about border on land, but border on sea are being established, and the surveillance, I mean, the question of the surveillance, and so I'm very concerned by that. And also, when I say the relation to water, it's also the way other culture relate to water, but even also in the West, in Europe. I mean, there was a relation of woman to water and fishermen to water, which has been buried, but which exists.
Thank you. Those were amazing papers. I guess I wanted maybe Claire to comment on Françoise in one question I had, and then another one. I'll start with the one for Françoise, which is just about literature and film. I was thinking of the White Sea Black Geography of Water, and thinking about that movie, that Robert Redford movie, Alone at Sea. Have you seen that? Alone at Sea.
Yes.
Which I think captures in some ways the kinds of things you're talking about. And in terms of the black geography of water of the Amitav Ghosh trilogy,
Yeah.
But in that you have the sort of lone individual, the kind of at sea, and then these tumultuous hordes of people. I wonder if there's a sort of individualist, collectivist piece in in the comparison that you're talking about. And the question I had for Claire is about the White Sea, Black Sea, the temporalities of the two, right? I mean, you talked about different kinds of temporalities and alternatives to the hegemonic capitalist accumulative, the story that Françoise tells, in effect, about the White Sea, right? But what about, what are the possibilities in the White Sea black geography of water contrast in terms of thinking different alternative temporalities, or an alternative temporality to the White Sea temporality?
Yeah, I mean, when I was saying the long road to freedom, which is really an expression, because yeah, I'm thinking of the question of patience. I mean, the African-American tradition is about, patience. Patience not in the sense of passivity, but that you move on, but you have to, you cannot renounce. I mean, if the first moment the slave, revolt and is killed, because that will, happen for centuries, you don't stop. You don't stop. You continue. I mean, and Mandela in his book, I mean, it's very interesting the way he look at time. He spends 27 years on Robben Island, away from his family. So the relation he has with time, I mean, he does not talk about it in terms of pessimism or optimism, and not also in terms of redemption. There was like no redemptive movement in spending 27 years in jail, but in terms of patience. Patience. The time will come. If it's not with me, it will come. So it's effectively not relation. And John, yes, there is something of effectively the White Sea is the unfettered individual, all the painting, the literature for boys that has been so, and still there. The film, a certain, there was effectively, I mean, 2012, but there was also this movie about this guy. I mean, it's on the northeast coast of America. There's a huge wave. They arrive and they all will drown or whatever. And it's this story of courage toward the sea, which is tough, but and the woman on the shore who cry, and all this is really narrative, whereas the black geography is the narrative of the collective. I mean, first, I mean, you have the slave ship together, but I mean, it's not just the Black Atlantic, it's also this other form of traveling over the sea, of incredible travel over the sea. So it's this other tradition that I'm looking at, where I think it's more collective, and also in this continuity between land and sea. Yeah,
And
a river,
mastery,
land, sea.
there isn't a need for mastery in the same way.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And of course, Amitav Ghosh is that is trilogy. Yeah.
Yes, it is a question, or maybe an echo for Françoise. I couldn't help thinking, listening to your compelling talk about Carl Schmitt. I guess I'm not the first one to bring his figure up when you are talking about water, I don't know. But it's really striking that so everything Schmitt wrote, for example, in a book, a small book called Land and Sea, or again in the Nomos of the Earth, i.e. that his idea was that you cannot draw borders or lines on the sea, you cannot appropriate the sea as you can appropriate the land, etc. And that gradually this assumption was questioned by the evolution of world political order. So, and you sort of you opposed that very strikingly. So I was thinking of your allusion to the refugee crisis in Europe. So in a way, I was thinking that it could fit in with Schmitt's view, in the sense that refugees on water, they are in a sort of no man's juridical or geopolitical no man's land, where only, between quotation marks, only human rights, in the generality of human rights are at work in a way, but there is so they don't belong. They are refugees in maybe in Hannah Arendt's sense, outlaws or not belonging to any nation state. But on the other hand, what you were suggesting is that the sea, the water, is the object of an incredible war of appropriation on the one hand, and this is where borders are traced. So it is very anti-Schmittian. So I was wondering if you have any comment on that.
I mean, the way in which what has happened to state is expanding, and the fact that you have going to have the floating city, you have already the offshore oil place, which are huge places, very important, with armed people, and the fact that the refugees, they are wandering and drowning. It's really, to me, it's like an attempt to reproduce on sea what is on land, where you are allowed to live and those who are not allowed to live anywhere. I mean, so, but at sea, you just send them to their death, right? So you don't have the slum, you have the cemetery, So it's where you live, and otherwise it's death, right? So it's much clearer than on land in a way. The imperialist doctrine of the 17th century, of the so-called liberty on sea, was totally, of course, was not liberty. It was liberty for some. The fact that it's being even challenged today, that the fact that you almost start to defend, to want to protect the 17th century imperialist doctrine against the 21st century doctrine of a privatization, tell you also where we are perhaps at that moment. For me, I mean, the criminalization of rescue, the delimitation, it's really, it raises ethical question. I don't have really the answer beside, but yeah, for me, and the fact that we even the narrative about refugee I see, and so as you say, human rights and so on, it totally erase all what is at stake in that story, because it become a humanitarian question. We have to save them or whatever. Or even now, for instance, you will forbid them to cross the sea to protect them. So you will keep them in Libya and everywhere because crossing, so the sea, even the notion of protection over the sea, and so which goes with the criminalization of rescue, is effectively keeping people on land. And even sometime with my friend in Africa, I mean, the discourse that we should stay in Africa, we don't have to go. I say, it's dangerous, because the question of mobility should be a question of mobility, and mobility over the sea also. That effectively, I mean, something is happening over the sea that, as if, some land can be left. After all, why care about the land, is if you can protect the oil, the mine, and which is already happening in Africa, right? You have an entire zone, and suddenly you got like protected zone with private armies. So you can let, and then you control the sea, and you control this place, and you have like a different cartography, and you have floating cities for some people. And so for me, it's really a question of thinking, what the nation may do in that, or the sovereignty, because it's totally transforming, and it's already in the law, in the International Convention. It's already there.
Oh, I wasn't going to answer. I was going to ask another question.
Thank you so much. Those wonderful papers. Thank you. Excellent papers and a lot to think about. I just wanted to bring back this question. Perhaps you feel that you've already answered it, but in the spirit of sort of oceanic circulation, I'll just bring it back round again about temporality and the oceanic. And to ask that we think again, Nick already mentioned Christina Sharp's In the Wake, but one moment in Sharp's In the Wake is this beautiful discussion, moving discussion of what would happen to the bodies that were thrown overboard on like the Zong, a close description of a body entering the ocean and a close description of that body unbecoming its flesh, and mingling in a long paragraph, pages really, or in my memory that's the way it is, pages, and becoming the atoms, sort of molecularizing with the sea. And the suggestion of that the ocean are the ancestors. There's the temporality there is very different. On the other hand, she also writes very astutely, she says it's both timeless and in time, in the sort of both and of Black feminist thought that's so productive, that means a temporality is, a sort of multiplicity of temporalities, if you will, that are syncopated, that don't contradict each other. And the ocean, or this question of wakeness, or being in the wake of history, and so to remind us that someone like Jordy Rosenberg, who writes sort of against molecularization, the sort of problem in an essay that she writes about molecularization of sexuality, that thinking with molecularization might absent us from thinking about history. I feel that what Christina Sharp is doing in this kind of analysis is an allowing of these molecularized bodies to still also be have profound historical particularity. And somehow it's the ocean, right, that helps with that kind of thinking. So I don't know, it's a question between you about time and water, or maybe it's, can I end my question with a poem that I thought you might want to know, since again, like the Layli Long Soldier poem, this one is by Naria Waheed, it's very short, it's called Salt. If the ocean can calm itself, so can you. We are both salt water mixed with air.
Actually, I could bounce off of that, because I was going to ask you, Françoise, a question similar to this, and especially what you ended with the salt. We're all salt water and what, air? Mixed with air. In the sense that, but more so than only, I don't want to be reductive, but only temporality, it's also spatiality and more than human, more than human mobility, right? I was thinking in terms of the migrant crisis, a good amount of, one aggravating factor that led to the Syrian civil war was drought, right? And so to an extent, what is the relationship between salt water and drinkable water, and how does that inform the movement of humans, is something I was thinking of also. So I guess that's, because there's water itself, like water as the element, as the natural force, is also agentic in this mobility, not only as vehicle on, but also through the hydrological cycle, through following drinking water, drinkable water, and because we're composed of it. And actually, Estrida Neymanes, for example, talks about us as bodies of water, right? So I wonder if you have thoughts also on the spatiality, or the water as non-human mobility.
I first I had wanted to do, rivers, lake, sea, and ocean, to the constant connection, in fact, that exists also. And the importance of rivers and lake for the imagination, for transportation, for commerce, for connection, for cultural exchange. But then I thought it would be too much. I would have to cover too much. And then the question of the crisis of water, access to water, and there was a connection. What I'm suggesting is to rethink land and water as a continuum. So drinking water, salt water, dry lake being, disappearing, less water, ocean rising, all this, how do we going to think that spatiality? And, because scientists tell us that some city going to disappear, right? Because the water is rising in Bangladesh, and then how you connect also the fact that's going to happen in Bangladesh with the crisis of migrants, the Rohingya from Myanmar, because the migrants are not just from Africa to Europe, they are all over the place. They are elsewhere also. And so so for me it would be, yes, this oceanic topography to trace from the history of those who were cargo, of those today who effectively are fleeing drought and find themselves over sea and drone. I mean, all this effectively to rethink that time and space. What does it say about being in the world, about also then rethinking border, rethinking nation, rethinking the citizenship, not just dropping all that, but rethinking them. Because this movement, and effectively there will be more and more movement because of water, either drought or too much water, the flood and everything. So there is a question of water that is treated as it's a passive element that arrive and flood. I mean, there are too many flood, or you've got a tsunami or whatever. And then as if, so we have to protect ourselves from the sea. So you build walls. Walls are being built against the sea, more and more, everywhere, in Japan and everywhere. And so it's a total misunderstanding of what is the sea. I mean, what is water? What is water then? In its drinking water, water of lake, rivers, wells, and water of the sea. That's just what I'm suggesting. And the question also, if there is also in terms, there is the famous image in Derek Walcott, The Sea, is a story of, body into corals. So how if you could look at the sea as, and there are another poem, but I cannot remember, in which, in fact, the life underwater is a life populated by all the ghosts.
I think it's refreshing to have this book without mentioning the keyword. Although I know a good way to connect it, but I will not say it aloud. And it's a good moment to end this wonderful 2 days, and to thank everyone who stayed alive well and kept listening to us. Great, thank you both, and thank you.